types of outcomes we might come to. So that might be association between variables, which is a little bit weaker, or something stronger like a cause and effect relationship between variables. We're going to look at why we make different conclusions based on the type of study. So the two main types of studies we'll be looking at are observational studies and experimental studies. Sometimes you might see those called controlled experiments. So the difference here, observational studies, in these studies, the researcher does not assign subjects to any particular treatment or group. So we'll add that definition here. Researchers do not assign subjects to groups. Now, sometimes this is a little bit misleading because people say, oh, there's groups, it has to be an experiment. Not necessarily true. Just because you're not assigning subjects to groups doesn't mean they don't exist. A simple one will be gender, for example. Researchers are not going to assign someone a particular gender. Those just already exist. So you want to see if they're specifically being assigned to groups, not necessarily presence or absence of groups, but how they're getting into those groups. So observational, not assigned to groups, they just already are and they already exist. Experimental studies, on the other hand, researchers do assign subjects to groups. And that one little difference, removing that word not, whether subjects are put into groups or just observed in groups, makes all the difference in the types of conclusion you can make. So observational studies, and we'll talk about why in just a moment. Observational studies, researchers not assigning subjects to groups, only allows us to show association, that weaker relationship between two variables. However, if we do assign subjects to groups, we do have a little bit more oomph in our conclusion, so to speak. These studies are able to show cause and effect, or causation, by that random assignment. So before we think about that why, let's just jot down a little side note here that's commonly missed. And I just want to reiterate that both types of studies can have groups. It's how you get into those groups. If you're randomly assigned by a researcher, it's an experiment. If it's a group that already exists, some kind of pre-existing condition, then that's an observational study. So both can have groups. It's how you get into those groups that's the difference. Okay, so let's think about the difference in these two. Why does randomly assigning allow us to show cause and effect? The example I usually use is one from this student a few years ago about the video games. So suppose you looked at kids that played video games, and you probably cannot go into homes and do it as an experiment and say, hey, you play a bunch of violent video games, you play Mario Kart, you just don't play any video games. You probably could not run it as an experiment, so you have to do this as an observational study. You just look at the different homes of children, you kind of observe and record the types of video games they're playing and how often they're playing them. You look at them several years later, and you see what kind of behaviors they have. And maybe you do observe that those that played more violent video games when they were children had more violent behaviors and tendencies as adults. Now, why could you not say that there was a cause and effect in that situation? If you pause and think about it, you might be able to think of lots of reasons. One big reason might be home life. That might be another variable that would affect a child's upbringing and behavior. Maybe they're playing lots of video games because they have parents who aren't really present and around and not teaching and training and raising them. And that's actually the root cause of their behavior. It's not necessarily the violent video games. So when you don't randomly assign subjects to groups, that means there could be all these other variables that are maybe a little bit more predominant in one of the groups than the others, and those other variables are the root cause. Those other variables have a name in statistics. We call them lurking variables or confounding variables. So let's jot that reasoning down here so you have that in your notes. We'll say experimental studies, or I'll just say experiments, show causation because the effects of lurking variables, I'm going to underline that because that's a vocab word you need to know, or again, sometimes you might see these called confounding variables, even though they're not exactly the same thing. And the reason is when you randomly assign, think of that video game example, if we could randomly assign kids to play different types of video games, then all the different home lives would be represented in all the different groups and wouldn't be disproportionately affecting one group over another. So by doing an experiment and randomly assigning to groups, all those lurking variables, those third-party variables that are influencing the results, are not heavy in one group over another. They are evenly dispersed among all groups. All right, in the next video, we're going to practice a couple of examples of this, making sure we can identify if a study is observational or experimental, explaining why, knowing the type of conclusion, and then being familiar with this terminology of lurking variables.